Good afternoon. My name is Tim Doyle, and I'm a senior advisor here at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C. For those that have been following ESG issues here in D.C., they've come to realize that BPC has been a leader in trying to help define what ESG means to a number of different stakeholders. Environmental, social, and governance issues have been gaining significant traction over the last couple of years. For some, ESG issues are part and parcel, I should say, to sustainability issues. For others, they think of corporate social responsibility, and in some cases, just brings to mind impact investing. Regardless of what you call it or how you think of it, at the core of ESG issues is disclosure. Disclosure has been a theme here at BPC as of late, as the Securities and Exchange Commission grapples with it. Today, we are incredibly fortunate to have two of the leading voices on capital markets and the SEC in particular. We currently have Congressman Huizenga linked in with us. We are awaiting Congressman Meeks, who is running a tad late, but should be joining us momentarily. Congressman Huizenga, I wanted to thank you again for coming on and appreciate your time.
Good to be with you, and glad we can have this healthy conversation. It's at times it gets to be, maybe shall we say, a robust conversation, but healthy and respectful, hopefully, nonetheless.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to, if you wouldn't mind, Congressman, indulge me. I want to give you a little background on you for the people that are watching. Congressman Huizenga grew up in West Michigan. Originally worked for former Congressman Pete Hoekstra. Started and owns a successful business. Was elected to the Michigan legislature in 2002. Hard to believe it's been that long. And for the record, I have known Congressman Huizenga since that time in the Michigan legislature, having also been born and raised in the great state of Michigan and West Michigan in particular. Congressman, it's great to have you. Congressman Huizenga was elected to Congress in 2010, representing the 2nd District of Michigan. Since that time, he has worked on multiple bipartisan task forces, which here at BPC we take notice of, including the Great Lakes and PFAS task forces. Congressman Huizenga is a senior member of the House Financial Services Committee and currently serves as the ranking member of the Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets Subcommittee. Here he focuses on oversight of the SEC and the capital markets, of course. Also serves on the Housing, Community Development, and Insurance Subcommittee. Again, Congressman, thank you for coming on. And when Congressman Meeks gets linked on here, we can give a little bit of background on him. Before we begin, though, I did want to acknowledge those watching on YouTube or Facebook and following us on Twitter. Please submit your questions online in the chat function or at hashtag BPC Live. So I think with that, Congressman, I'll just jump right in. ESG, it's been an expanding topic. It has changed the debate with regard to investments and disclosure. This may be best exemplified by the fact that over 90% of S&P 500 companies now produce sustainability reports in some fashion, which has been a significant increase over the last few years. So let's start with this question. Does the existing SEC regulatory framework have the flexibility to handle the influx of these ESG issues? Or is ESG issues just too broad to handle and thus the current framework needs to be updated? Congressman?
Yeah, well, I think you need to add one other element to that, Tim, which is, does the SEC have the technical ability to deal with the information coming at them? And if they're going to be the arbiter of that, that puts them in a very different spot than where they currently are. You know, right now, they are there to protect investors from fraud, right? That was the whole reason why they put it in. And somebody I know, as Tim had alluded, Tim and I know each other pretty well, and I know he's a student of history. And coming from Grand Rapids, Michigan, we all grew up knowing the name Arthur Vandenberg. Arthur Vandenberg was a senator from Grand Rapids who was probably most notably attached to the creation of NATO and the Berlin airlift and the plan that literally rebuilt Germany. But what he also was heavily involved in the 1930s was all of the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and a lot of those first investor protections as they were coming off of the great crash in 1929. And that main central goal of the Securities and Exchange Commission for 80 years plus has been protecting investors from fraud, making sure that there is creation of capital and that the markets are efficient. And then the market is supposed to be dealing with, and investors are supposed to be dealing with, what is the material information that is necessary for that particular business and for them as a particular investor, whether they be institutional or individuals. What information do they need? That's been the real, I think, pinch for many of us as we've been having this discussion. Not that things like conflict minerals, for example. Chair White famously discussed this when Dodd-Frank was passed about determining whether conflict minerals fit into this box. And she said, might be a very, very laudable goal. The question is do we have the expertise to be able to deal with the issue? And I think the answer repeatedly has been no. So that's, you asked about flexibility within the law. I think there certainly is the expectation of materiality and that disclosure and transparency for those companies and for those investors that need that information, and that's still the standard that I hold on. And I see my friend Greg Meeks is getting on, and he and I have had a number of opportunities to work together and in a very cooperative manner, bipartisan manner. We do disagree on issues. This is one of those issues that we maybe disagree on some of the approaches. But I think we do have common expectations that we are protecting investors and that we are hopefully creating playing fields that are relevant to folks as they are in that investing space.
Hey, I see, obviously, Congressman Meeks. Thank you for joining us. Obviously, I was just talking to Congressman Huizenga about an issue that I'll ask you about in a second, and talked about the expansion of ESG issues. But before that, for the audience, and that those, it's hard to believe, but those that may not know too much about you, I wanted to give you a little background. I'll give a little background on you, if you're all right with that.
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm having a little technical difficulty, so I hear you. Obviously, I think you can see me, although I can't see you, but we'll go with it as it is. I got a blank screen.
Okay, well, we'll hopefully by the time I'm done with a little bit of your background for those watching, we'll have that sorted out. Congressman Meeks grew up in New York, worked as assistant district attorney, and was later elected to the New York State Assembly in 1992. Having been a former prosecuting attorney in the great state of Michigan, it's nice to connect with former prosecutors, of course. Congressman Meeks was elected to Congress in 1998, representing the 5th District of New York, which I believe encompasses most of Queens, if not all of Queens, and a little bit more maybe. Through the years, Congressman Meeks has earned the respect of both Democrats and Republicans. He currently is chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, is also a senior member of the House Financial Services Committee, previously having served as chairman of the subcommittee on consumer protection and financial institutions. Most recently, his previously introduced bill, I think it's HR 1277, was included in the recently passed Corporate Governance Improvement Investor Protection Act of 2021. That bill, I'm summarizing here, of course, that bill requires corporations to disclose demographics of their board of directors, requires the SEC to analyze and report on those disclosures, as well as creates a diversity advisory group. It's also worth mentioning that at least of this original bill, the congressman did have the support of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Congressman, just wanted to, with that background, wanted to welcome you to the discussion. So glad that you are able to join us today.
Thank you. It's good to be with you. It's always good to be with my friend Bill Huizenga, who is a good friend. We work together very closely on a number of issues. And as he indicated, those issues that we don't agree upon, we debate them. among ourselves and do that in a way that is fitting for who we are as the United States, and that's what the democratic process is all about. So it's always good to be with Bill.
Perfect. And I apologize for that background noise. If people can hear it, hopefully that won't be here the whole time. Congressman Meeks, what I'll do is I'll just read the first question that I had that Congressman Huizenga was answering when you joined on, and I'll just reread it, which is the ESG has changed the debate with regard to investment and disclosure. This may be best exemplified by the fact that over 90% of S&P 500 companies now produce sustainability reports, which is an incredibly significant increase over the last few years. So Congressman Meeks, as ESG issues have greatly expanded over the last few years, is there a theoretical end in sight on ESG disclosures, or should companies just expect to disclose on an ever increasing list of those issues?
Look, I think it's fair to say that companies can expect more robust and expanded ESG disclosure rules in both the near and the long-term futures, and I say that for a couple of reasons. First reason is I believe that the SEC has been clear about its direction on ESG, as is confirmed by its most recent spring rules list. And I also believe that the SEC will be successful in proposing a robust set of rules around broad diversity and climate change at the very least, which will be finalized after a thorough rulemaking process. Furthermore, to your question as to whether or not there will be an end in sight with respect to new ESG rules, I don't think an expectation that ESG conversation will end is a reasonable expectation, given our evolving world, emerging risks, and corporate innovations. Material risks, including those posed by climate, emerge and evolve continuously. And so we've experienced record-setting fires, for example, in our West Coast, and more severe flooding in coastal communities, and like the one I represent in New York, we're seeing more floods than ever. And we've also developed new understandings of how often ignored risk directly impact businesses' bottom line. So just last year, biodiversity risk, the idea that there are financial risk companies face from the destruction of natural ecosystems, that was identified by the head of the ESG research for HSBC Bank as a major risk the banking sector has ignored. And that's from HSBC, not just a social advocacy organization. So let me conclude by just saying that investors have increasingly expressed that climate change is among one of their top concerns when making investment decisions, because these types of factors have substantial impacts on both the short and the long-term values of the companies. And these evolve, as they move forward, as the evolution continues, so too will the disclosure conversation. So yes, we'll continue to see an expansion of ESG rules, but that doesn't necessarily mean an expansion of unnecessary disclosures. Our financial system, including our regulatory framework, will have to continue to evolve as our world does. So that means new rules in the future, recalibration of other rules. That's just the way things go. Accordingly, therefore, we can expect a continued conversation around ESG and meaningful rule changes. And that's just how the policymaking process works. And I believe that's how it should work.
Well, to that point,
Tim,
sorry, Congressman Huizenga.
Yeah, I was just curious. I just wanted to echo that to a certain degree. This is something that Chairman Meeks and I agree on. I think that this issue isn't going to go away. It's going to keep going to keep advancing and moving ahead. But as Greg wasn't able to, I don't think, heard maybe some of my earlier answer. Well, the question is, are we prepared, and is the SEC prepared? And that's really where I see a lot of the rub happening in that. If this is really never ending, where are we going to stop and start this thing is problematic. And I just, again, having 80 years of a system that worked, that still does punish those companies that should disclose something but don't, and whether it's through the regulators or through the courts, that's been a system that has worked. And again, I think at the end of the day, having investors, whether they be individuals or whether they be institutional investors, working as shareholders with those companies to determine what should be that material information that's brought forward is a better way to go.
Well, I did, speaking, Congressman Meeks, you mentioned about obviously the SEC and what they're doing. And I know, as you both are well aware, in March of this year, then acting chair Allison Lee put out a request for public comment, request for information on climate risk and ESG disclosures. Many think that the SEC will put out a proposed a notice of proposed rulemaking sometime early fall. So before we get too further, or we get into how Congress has responded, I wanted to see what you both thought. I know Congressman Meeks, you expressed some opinions. Would love to get both your opinions as to what you think the SEC will likely do, given the information that has been submitted to them in that request for public comment.
Well, I think I would leave it to the SEC. The question of changing and moving around as far as materiality standard, determining materiality requires facts and circumstances analysis that the regulators are best fit to consider. I don't think that's something that necessarily we should necessarily do in Congress, because when it comes to what material means, for example, it has consistently been the case that materiality is assessed through the eyes of a reasonable investor. However, wherever there are gaps in how materiality is determined in the regulatory space, Congress should step up, I think, and potentially put forward a duty to disclose the statute. And that was, actually, that was my approach by introducing my corporate diversity disclosure bill. Similarly, I believe that Congress should fill that gap by legislating a duty to disclose climate risk if the SEC falls short in putting forth robust ESG disclosure requirements. So, let's leave it up to the SEC. Let's see where they go and let Congress push them in the right direction, I think.
Congressman Meeks, it's interesting you bring that up, because I know, and we're going to talk about the bill that just passed, but in that there's a provision, and I want to say that it's in Title I of it, that defines materiality in that ESG is de facto material. And so that's one of the questions that I have. I guess we can jump ahead a little bit, because as long as we're there, and ask if that's the case, and that the determination of materiality is no longer with the issuer or the corporation, but is dictated by the SEC. How does that work from a material? By saying that if it's ESG, and then I guess we can ask who determines what it's ESG. But if it's ESG, it's de facto material. That seems to change securities law, does it not?
Well, no, I think that the title that you referenced expresses the sense of Congress that ESG metrics are material, but leaves the definition of ESG metrics to the SEC, which would establish appropriate parameters via the rulemaking process. So, look, I think that the legislation that we're talking about appropriately provides the SEC with as much latitude to determine the contours of what's material underneath the ESG umbrella. And again, consistent with the entire the SEC rather, disclosure regime. And it will be the expectation that the SEC relies heavily on feedback from investors, issuers, and other obligated persons. That's that's the way I see it.
Huizenga, I don't know if you want to weigh in on this. I was going to ask that because I know that some of us have talked that ESG, although because of the breadth of issues that ESG covers, traditionally or historically, this has been done under Regulation SK and kind of a robust discussion about whether it should be included and then done so. But in this particular case, or so it seems from the request for public input, the SEC is thinking about just adding all of the ESG information. And I'm just curious how people think that's going to work. It's we've been talking internally about it for quite some time.
Yeah, I can't explain how it's going to work because I don't see it working. I think that's one of the bigger challenges with this. And, you know, as towards the motivation of Chair Gensler and the SEC, I think they absolutely are wanting to push in that direction. I'm very concerned about the growing politicization of regulators, and that would include the SEC. And I think, as you pointed out, Tim, you know, being able to have the SEC de facto declare something, what's to say that they couldn't go back retroactively on this? Way, you know, is it a moment moving forward? I mean, if they are given that much latitude, that becomes a dramatic departure from where we have seen corporate law and investor protection law thus far. And again, I would go back to sort of Mary Jo White's discussion of some of the conflict minerals and the Dodd-Frank Act, what those requirements were, that they simply are not experts in these fields. Yet now we're expecting Congress is handing this over to these regulators to say, you figure it out. We've given you the broad areas. Oh, by the way, on occasion, we might get very specific about what we want to see you do. And that's a lot of mixed messages. Again, instead of looking at shareholders coming forward with proposals, making the case as to why those proposals and disclosures make sense for that industry or for them as investors, and then having it literally come down to a vote of the people that are owning the company. I mean, that's one of the concerns I have. One of our colleagues on the committee last year had made a statement that she thought that if a privately held company became too big or too important, were her words, for society, then we should force them to become publicly traded so we can put them under the regulation of the Securities and Exchange Commission. And that, you know, that's the kind of logical conclusion, I'm afraid, sometimes where this leads. And that is, I think that's antithetical to our economic system, certainly our legal system. And I'm very reticent to just hand this over to a regulatory agency, bureaucrats or not, or political appointees, and say, you go figure this out. When in my mind, the marketplace has done a pretty darn good job of figuring out what businesses need to disclose, what material information, so that those investors have that protection and have that information that they need.
Yeah, and Congressman Meeks, I know that based on your bill and knowing a little bit about your background, I know that the disclosure of diversity issues is incredibly important to you, one in which you think that there are, what my guess is would argue that it is in fact material, and that would be the de facto, I guess, argument when it comes to listing the diversity of board members and how companies are dealing with diversity issues. So there are certain issues, it seems like, either via Congress or the SEC that they have determined are material. I just wanted to see if you could comment on that.
Yeah, because there's a balancing act that needs to be played here, because the SEC, in my belief, should put forth dynamic ESG rules and that provide flexibility in light of an ever evolving market, but also provide sufficient direction so that disclosures are actually useful to the investors. And as you talked about, my board diversity bill, which, as you know, was included in amendment to HR 1187, was my response to this problem. The bill discloses and requires specific disclosures around race, gender, and ethnicity, and veteran status, for example, for public companies and board of directors and senior management. So I thought that this proposal is necessary because over the next 10 years, investors have argued, well, actually, for the last 10 years, investors have argued to policymakers at the SEC and in Congress. They've come to my office that the current board diversity rule does not yield useful information because of how the rule was written. So the example is, since the initial rule did not define diversity, public companies had little direction on how to best disclose, and accordingly have complied in varying ways, which have rendered the disclosures of little value to investors. And unless you have the SEC being involved, I don't necessarily think that the market on its own would have done what we had to do with our diversity bill. And that's why I think it's important that we give direction and allow the SEC to push forward, but give them the flexibility to do what they have to do, given the scenario of what's happening in the market as we move forward, and for some things that we may not know today that will be effective tomorrow. It's got to be like a living body.
And I think some of the concerns that have been expressed to me or in conversations is that diversity has a very bipartisan support for disclosure on, but it's that, and we could talk about, and this is the lead into the question about the broader package of bill, which deals with a number of different mandated disclosures on a number of different topics. So many people say that diversity is a relatively easy one to say, yes, okay, that makes sense. That would be material as an investor, a reasonable investor would want to know that of their board members, et cetera. But when we start getting into some of the other issues that were included in the bill, I think people are a little more confused. So that's the lead into the question, which is on the bill that I mentioned. And I'll start, Congressman Huizenga, with you. I know that you, along with a number of your Republican colleagues, I think all of them, as a matter of fact, and a few Democrats, should note, voted against HR 1187, which was this broader package omnibus bill that included such bills as Congressman Meeks just mentioned. I guess the question is, and this is a very open-ended, why did you vote no? And is there anything in there that you could have supported?
Yeah, and I do want to touch on the kind of a continuation of what you had actually brought up originally as one of those questions is, where is the end, right? Is there an end in sight? And while Greg and I might be able to agree on ethnic diversity, by the way, vast improvement over some discussion about forcing companies to have a category that has to get checked off. But in this sort of woke environment, sexual orientation had to be added to the list. So, and you look at what happened to Tim Cook at Apple, who was involuntarily outed and didn't want to have this be a part of his conversation, right? And because it wasn't material about whether he was a good CEO or not. And that's what I'm afraid of, is where we're seeing some of the politics sort of overcome what are very good intentions, and in some areas might be good directions to go. But again, giving it sort of that force of law and that club, that cudgel that regulators have and that they can wield is dangerous territory in my mind. So are there some things in that bill? I mean, first of all, you got to remember that 1187 was a conglomeration. It pulled in a ton of different ideas and bills and different areas. The chair and I had a robust, I think it was 2.5 hours on the House floor discussing it. As you point out, actually, there was bipartisan opposition to it, so much so that it ended in a tie vote, and the Speaker of the House had to come down and personally vote to pass the bill, which is she doesn't do that often. No speaker typically will go in and vote on a lot of those things. So again, we'll go back to the materiality aspect of it. Go back to the relevance. I'm afraid that in an effort to catch everything, right, whatever that definition of everything is, there will be disincentives for these companies to use the public markets to create capital, or to utilize capital, to access capital. And what that means for everyday investors, whether it be CalPERS, right, or whether it be individual investors, that is going to be a continuation of limited options for them. And I know Greg has heard me say this. We always talk about unicorns. Well, you can't call a herd of these things a unicorn. A unicorn's a one-off, right? We've got herds of them, where we've got multi-billion-dollar privately held companies that for various reasons, and I would argue one of those reasons is they look at the cost and the challenges of going public, of maintaining their public status, and then they have these types of things where non-shareholders are coming in and forcing them to make decisions and disclose things that may not matter to a medical device company, for example. And so that was my opposition to it. I thought it was overly broad. At the end of the day, if we're talking about very narrow, singular issues that should be addressed, I am very welcome to have that conversation. I'm afraid that this has become such a wide net that we're dragging in everything, and at the end of the day, if we've got everything in there, then it really loses the punch of the real reason for the SEC to come in, which is, again, to protect investors from fraud, to create liquidity, and to have a healthy, robust marketplace.
Congressman Meeks, as I mentioned earlier, I know your bill, which was, again, one of the bills included in the larger package we were just talking about, did have bipartisan support, from my understanding, and at the very least, I know had the support of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which isn't always easy to get their support in some of the disclosure type areas, but they obviously thought it important enough to support. So my question to you is, I suppose, the reverse of what I've just asked Congressman Huizenga, which is, I know that you and many of your Democratic colleagues voted for HR 1187. I guess why, other than your own bill, which of course you would support, is there anything in there, or why did you vote for it? And then is there anything in there that you wouldn't have supported had it been broken out into individual pieces? Congressman, I think you might be on mute.
Let me explain this. Let me tell you, I voted for HR 1187 because I agreed with the overall direction of the legislation, which is to provide regulatory clarity and consistency to public companies on how best to disclose ESG risk in response to widespread investor demands. The fact of the matter is that 90% of the S&P 500 index companies already provide their investors with supplemental disclosure on a variety of ESG issues, which, you know, I think they should be applauded for. Public companies have played a critical role in advancing conversations around ESG that should be acknowledged and celebrated also. However, from the investor perspective, disclosures are most useful when they are comparable, which requires a certain level of consistency in reporting. And that's where we have a gap in the law, which Congress is trying to plug. With that said, of course, there's no bill that's introduced that's perfect, except maybe a bill that I put together, you know. But the legislative process is such that there are multiple opportunities to fine-tune legislation, whether that's in a markup or whether it's on the House floor or in negotiations with the regulators and in conference with the Senate. There's ways that we can do that. So all in all, my reasons for voting yes was because of my overwhelming support for the bill's direction and my understanding that the legislative process is purposeful and long, and one that has an ample opportunity for what? Enhancements. So no bill is perfect. We always work on it. That's why we generally say, you know, there's room at the end. You want to make sure that you can improve it, and there's negotiations that's going back and forth in that regards. That is also the art and the beauty of the legislative process. That's what makes us who we are. That's why I think this is the best body that the planet has seen with the way that we do business. That's why we need to have these debates back and forth and share ideas and often have the compromise that's necessary to push things forward when no one gets everything of what they want. Now, nevertheless, there is one area where I believe that the SEC is best suited to lead on ESG, and that's on coordination with foreign securities regulators. You know, I'm also the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and understanding that our economy is global and risks like climate change are global, international engagement will be necessary to get new ESG disclosure rules done right. So accordingly, I appreciate the recent comments from John Coates at the SEC, who noted that it would be counterproductive to have multiple ESG standards for companies that operate across borders, especially considering that many ESG risks are cross-border in nature. And the SEC doesn't have an Office of International Affairs, which is equipped to lead on international regulatory and enforcement cooperation. So all in all, I believe that the bill we voted on heads in the right direction, and hopefully it inspires robust rules and come out of the SEC, which I think they've indicated an understanding that ESG has to be implemented in coordination with other sovereign governments. So that's the reason why I voted on it. But are there rooms to improve? Are there ways that you can narrow? Listening to Bill? Of course there is. But that's part of the process. And we go through it. I'd rather take a bill that's much broader and then start focusing down than start with a bill that's basically a skinny bill and leave a lot of things out that should be included therein.
Can I jump in on something here on this, Tim?
Sure, Congressman.
Please, I know Greg wants to do this too. He and I both emphasize we've got a great personal relationship. It's a policy debate, and this is outside his control. But there was no amendments allowed on these bills, right? And while my bills might be perfect and Greg's bills might be perfect, there is a perfecting process, which is the amendment process. That's what typically brings us a better end product. The observation I would make is that sometimes it felt like it was more of a negotiation with the Senate than it certainly was with any of the Republicans that were in the chamber, which is why I think you saw no Republican support for this broader package, even though there are issues within that certainly I would support, or some of my other colleagues would potentially support. But oftentimes it's not just the destination, it is the journey, how you get to that destination. And the only thing I can hope for is that in the future, after we see what happens in the Senate, that we might have some of that opportunity. I think, though, it's going to be harder, having been in the majority previously with a Senate that was held by my party. I know I had bills come out of the House of Representatives with unanimous consent that the Senate refused to take up. And seeing something like this, which is pretty controversial, at least as an adoption of process and the role of the SEC, I'm not sure that we're going to get to the destination where my friends on the other side are hoping to go, because the message that we should be having is there's consensus, and at this point there isn't on that.
But just on that, because I think that there were amendments that were presented, but they were voted down. Whether it was in Rules Committee, in markup, there was en bloc. So I mean I can recall when and that's part of, I guess, what we got to try to figure out, both Democrats and Republicans. But when Democrats were in the minority, our amendments often are voted down. And here is where I think that, again, why you do deal with the Senate, because there's another opportunity there to negotiate. And often I would think that the chair and the ranking members of the committee will have dialogue and conversation among themselves to see where there can be that kind of compromise. But I think that amendments are put up, and often this is not unique to a Democratic majority. As I said, I spent a great deal of my career as a Democratic in the minority, and our amendments were voted down, which is what happened here. It's just part of the process. That's not something that's unique.
Suppose, if anything, it's just unique to the House as opposed to the Senate. When the majority rules, the majority clearly rules. But Congressman Meeks, I know you mentioned it, and it certainly has been discussed outside the halls of Congress, that this, in the end, was in fact a messaging bill, telling the SEC what you as a legislative body thought important, and that they should be considering in their rulemaking process, although obviously not that explicit. That's certainly the feedback that I've been getting in having conversations. Before we go to the next question, though, I did want to remind everybody watching on YouTube or Facebook or following us on Twitter, please submit your questions online in the chat function or at #BPC Live. So I did want to move on. One of the things that we touched on just briefly, Congressman Meeks, I think actually you mentioned it, brought it up, which is mandatory disclosure. SEC Chairman Gensler has signaled that mandatory disclosure, as opposed to the current principle-based disclosure framework, will be what is necessary for that consistent and comparable information, Congressman Meeks, that you mentioned, for investors. That is the comparable information for investors to make informed decisions. So I'm going to start, Congressman Huizenga, with you. And we briefly touched on this, but is the current principle-based disclosure framework able to handle these ESG, the amount of ESG the data that is out there that falls under the umbrella? And if so, how can the SEC make sure that it's consistent and comparable?
Again, that's part of what I struggle with. If you were a publicly traded oil exploration or a gas transportation pipeline company, you are going to have a set of very specific environmental questions that are relevant to your operation. How many spills have you had? What safety measures do you have? What impact do you have? That's very different for a medical device company. That might be a startup, or pick it. I mean, my area in Western Michigan. And by the way, you can always tell somebody from Michigan. You'll see Tim at some point hold his hand up and point to where he's from around on his palm. And everybody in your office is knowing exactly what I'm talking about. We have been a very entrepreneurial area, and it's been sort of this rite of passage in many ways. Sometimes it's generational, right? Where it's whether it's first generation to second generation or second to third, that there's decisions for various reasons to go public. And I can think of a number of specific small publicly traded companies in my area that have actually reverted back and have gone private again because of some of these things that they look at it and they look at the costs that it is to them. I mean, this is like, they have outside counsel, not a 300-person legal division. Right. They have a CPA that works with their CFO, not an entire accounting division. And that's who I think is really getting lost in this, is those smaller companies that are going to be forced to jump through the same hoops that these very large companies with lots of resources are going to be required to bring up. And that's why one of the discussions has been, is there some sort of exclusion, right, for companies of a certain size, whether it's number of employees, whether it, but then you distort that, because tech companies could have 10 people yet have hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. You can have some manufacturers or retailers that have very thin margins, that have a huge workforce but have comparatively small income streams. So when you start trying to have government try to figure out what those particulars are, that makes it very difficult. If you're a publicly traded retail store or retail operation, I'm not sure what some of those same disclosures, what beneficial information that brings to an investor that if you are having to force an oil company or energy company to disclose. So that's really, at the end of the day, where I struggle in all this.
Yeah, and I know, Congressman, that you mentioned small business at the very, I think it's Title 11 of the larger package. I think the bill requires the SEC to do a study on its impact on small business. So I know that, at least, and maybe to your point, they're certainly thinking and concerned about that, but how it's defined will be clearly the issue. And Congressman Meeks, so this would go back to you, a question on the same type of thing, when the mandatory disclosure, specifically ESG, as we mentioned, is huge. It has so many issues. How do you, as an investor, or as the SEC creating rules for investors, how do you do that to encompass all of that without requiring it to be mandatory?
Well, it has to be a dynamic and flexible, rule, so that you can move given the current activities for investing is concerned. As I said, there's things that 20 years ago that we're doing now that will affect ESG that 20 years ago was not even thought about. So it's got to be put forward in a manner that can be looked at, that is dynamic. Look, I mentioned before that I employed the current efforts of private industry to enhance their ESG disclosures, which would be consistent with shareholder demands. But the many investors that I know, and I could use the city of New York for example, they want to make sure that they have some kind of consistent and comparable disclosures, because inconsistent disclosures are often less value to investors, especially when they are compared to hundreds of pages in disclosures. So I'm not talking about, I think that there's got to be disclosure, but the disclosure has got to be flexible, and the SEC can work on that to get it done, as opposed to having either no disclosure or minimal disclosure for some, where you might come in with just a line and no one knows what that means. You say it's disclosed, and yet it doesn't give the investor the information that he or she needs and looking for, so they can make the determination of where they want to invest. When I think about the comptroller, for example, of the city of New York, who's investing a lot of the money of the workers, the public workers of the city of New York, they want to make sure that they know a lot about and some of the ESG issues that are in regards to companies, and they may comparatively shop as that regard. But if you don't get that information, and companies not required to give that information, then you come up with inconsistencies. And I think that you can, take into consideration what Bill was talking about, within reason, et cetera, the size of the companies and things of that nature, the number of employees, the type of business that's being done. I agree, a tech firm as opposed to a financial services firm may be looked at differently. So you can look at it per industry in that regard. I think there's ways to do that. But the fact that the investors are now and today are looking for certain information, I think that they should be required. The company should be required to disclose, because this is about making sure that the investor knows where that dollar is going and to whom that dollar is going to, and someone that is based upon the principles of which they believe in.
I think one quick, because I think part of this discussion is something that really hasn't been brought up yet. And I'm the only one of the three of us that actually isn't a lawyer. But, there's legal precedents that oftentimes really sculpt and shape what practices and what is material. So, for example, the SEC can bring an action. There's been a lawsuit over that. The courts have weighed in at various levels, and it becomes a commonly accepted practice or commonly accepted regulation, because either it was affirmed or denied from what the SEC had done, or really any other kind of regulators. And I know that Chairman Meeks threw out the word flexible, and flexibility being key. I'm afraid there's a fine line between flexibility and arbitrary. And that's what I'm afraid of, is when suddenly arbitrary political decisions are getting injected into this. And we have a desired goal of predictability. But I just don't believe this does it. And we have a body of corporate law that has stood the test of time in many ways. And we're going to be creating a lot of this out of whole cloth. And rather than having the industry set some standards, and here's a perfect example. I have a lot of agriculture in my district. There had been discussion about federal mandates on cage sizes for poultry, for example, right? And we had a bit of this epic battle back and forth, and industry actually stepped in, and all of the major restaurant, fast food chains and grocery stores and those kinds of things said, no, we're coming together. We are going to set those standards for, as consumers, of what we expect out of you for what defines free range, what defines organic, what defines these various definitions that there was some calls to have the federal government do that. And I think it's just, at the end of the day, it's a more effective way of making sure that the marketplace addresses those areas, rather than just having what can be well-intentioned but could become arbitrary applications of these rules.
Well, I really appreciate that from both of you. I know we're coming up on the top of the hour, but I did want to get a couple of questions in from the audience, and I'm going to try to combine them if I can, or at least a couple of them here. These are from Mark Walsh and Brian Langford. Mark asks, has the SEC and Congressman Huizenga, apologies. Congressman Huizenga,
I do have a first name.
has the SEC ever gone back in time to enforce something that they didn't? Because I think you'd mentioned that. And then this also, and I can ask both of you, Congressman Huizenga, you also brought up small businesses, because the other question from Brian Langford is corporations. I think, he writes, corporations have billions of dollars. Is it really such a problem if there are disclosure mandates that are not 100% applicable, but yet still required of them? So I got to ask both of you, I guess the first one to ask is, has the SEC ever gone back? I guess I can't think of an example, but I figured I'd ask both of you.
Yeah, I can't think of an example, but we are talking about unprecedented actions, and it does beg the question: what is some of the liability aspects? If you look at, for example, narcotics, right, and the wave that has hit our country, or you go back and look at what happened to tobacco companies and the settlements, that was through the courts. But what happens when you start dragging regulators into that as well? And so I hope not. It would be unprecedented, but we're talking about a number of unprecedented things.
Right. And Congressman Meeks, and I know that, again, as the bill talks about this, I imagine that you probably would support some kind of parameters when, for instance, Brian Langford's question assumes that corporations have billions of dollars in revenue to do this. As those corporations get smaller and smaller, the SEC has, at least historically, give an exception to companies of a certain size. Is that something you would support, or does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. Whoops. Absolutely, that makes sense to me. And I think that, why I say that with the SEC, looking at it and being flexible and understanding you will take certain circumstances into consideration when making various determinations. That's the flexibility that I think that I'm saying that needs to be there, so that not to take an individual who is a small corporation to compare it to one of the big conglomerates. Now, they're two different scenarios, so you put them in their proper form. It's, just like when we discuss banks, oftentimes I don't want a small community bank to be considered just as we do one of the big international banks. That just doesn't make sense. So you set different standards, and you look at different areas in that regards, and it just makes common sense to do it that way.
I wanted to thank you much for your time this afternoon. It's we probably, all three of us, could talk about this for a long time. Here at BPC, we have been talking about this for now, I can't believe it's been years, as this topic continues to go up. We would, as the SEC goes forward, as the bill, the House bill we've been talking about today gets over to the Senate, maybe we can convince you guys to come back and give us an update.
Sounds good.
Wonderful.
Thanks for having us, and thanks for a great conversation there, Chairman Meeks.
Thank you. Likewise, Bill. See you soon.
All right.
See you.
And for those watching, please stay tuned. The BPC will have continuing events in this topic, that is the ESG topic. We've been doing so for the past year. I really appreciate your support and tuning in today. Thanks, and have a great day.